Stevie Wonder stopped playing. Not at the end of a bar, not between songs. His hands came off the keys in the middle of a chord, both of them simultaneously. The way hands come off something when the body has received a signal that overrides everything else. The music, the stage, the cameras, the 300 people sitting in the dark. He sat completely still at the piano. His head tilted slowly, almost imperceptibly, toward the back of the studio. The angle of it was not the angle of a man listening for a sound he expected. It was the angle of a man who has heard something he believed he would never hear again in his life. Jimmy Fallon was on his feet before he understood why he was on his feet. He looked at Stevie. He looked at the back of the studio. He looked at Stevie again. And then Jimmy Fallon, who had stood at this desk through floods and elections and every gradation of human joy and grief that a late-night stage can hold, sat back down in his chair and put both hands over his face and did not move for a very long time. It was a Thursday night taping, February 2024, The Tonight Show. Stevie Wonder, 73 years old, had come to perform. No interview component, no desk segment, just the piano and the voice and the particular miracle of Stevie Wonder playing live in a room small enough that you could hear him breathe between phrases. His publicist had been clear with the production team. He would perform 2 songs, he would wave to the audience, he would leave. This was how it worked now. The productions understood. The Tonight Show team had agreed and spent the following week rearranging the entire episode around the 12 minutes they had been given, because 12 minutes of Stevie Wonder at a piano was not 12 minutes. It was a different category of time entirely. The audience had felt this the moment he was wheeled to the bench and settled his hands on the keys. The specific hush of a room that has suddenly understood it is inside something rare. The first song had been extraordinary, in the way that only things are extraordinary, when the person making them has gone so far past mastery that the technique has become invisible, and what remains is pure intention. The audience sat in it the way people sit in rain, not sheltering from it, just inside it, letting it land. The applause afterward was the kind that means something, not the reflexive noise of a crowd doing what crowds do, but the sound of people who have been genuinely reached trying to say so with the only instrument available to them. Then Stevie settled his hands for the second song. He was 40 seconds in when his hands left the keys. And then from somewhere at the very back of the studio, close to the entrance where the ushers stood, a voice joined the melody he had just abandoned. Not a young voice. Not a trained voice. The voice of an older man. Low and slightly rough at the edges in the way that voices go after many decades of use, but carrying the melody with a precision and a tenderness that had nothing to do with performance and everything to do with a relationship built over a very long time in a private place. The voice was not loud. It was not asking to be heard. It was the voice of someone who had heard this song so many times, and from such a specific and personal place that when the melody appeared in the room without warning, the body simply responded before the mind could intervene. The way breathing responds, the way a hand reaches for a familiar object in the dark. Stevie Wonder's hands stayed off the keys. His head continued its slow tilt toward the source of the sound, a few more degrees, settling into alignment with the voice the way a satellite dish settles onto a signal it has been calibrated to find. His lips parted slightly. His shoulders, which had been carrying the slight forward lean of performance, dropped back and down into something that looked less like a posture and more like a state. The state of a person whose entire body has been organized around a single incoming sound. His right hand rose from beside the keys and pressed flat against his chest. Fingers spread, holding something in or letting something through. It was impossible to say which. Jimmy had seen Stevie Wonder perform 23 times in various contexts over his career. He had never seen Stevie Wonder be still. "Stevie," he said. The word came out barely above a whisper. He was already moving toward the edge of the stage, drawn there by some instinct that had nothing to do with producing a television show. He stopped at the lip of the stage and looked toward the back of the studio. "You okay?" Stevie Wonder did not answer. He sat at the piano with his hand on his chest and his head tilted at that precise angle. And from his face came an expression that his face had not worn in public in a very long time. Something unguarded. Something that belonged to a different part of his life entirely. The entire studio froze. The band had stopped at the moment Stevie's hands left the keys, the way musicians stop when the center of a performance has moved outside the music. Not one person in the audience made a sound. The ushers near the entrance had both gone completely still. The director in the control room held every camera and said nothing to anyone. A woman in the 5th row had her hand pressed over her mouth. The man beside her had taken her other hand without looking at her. An automatic gesture. The kind that happens when a room is generating something large enough to require physical anchoring. And then Stevie Wonder spoke. His voice came out of the stillness of the studio like something the stillness had been waiting to contain. "Amos." The voice from the back of the studio stopped singing. 300 people held their breath. To understand what happened next, you need to understand what happened in 1962. Stevie Wonder wasn't always Stevie Wonder. Not the legend, not the living monument, not the man whose name had become its own frequency in the culture. In the spring of 1962, he was 11 years old, which is to say he was a child, a specific, particular child named Stevie Morris, who had been blind since shortly after his premature birth, who had grown up in Detroit in a household where music was not a luxury, but a language, and who had been signed to Motown Records at the age of 10 by a man who had heard him play harmonica on a street corner and understood immediately that what he was hearing was not a talented child. It was something else, something that did not yet have the full shape of what it would become, but that already had a gravity to it, a pull, the way certain rivers have a pull that you feel before you reach them. He was 11 years old and famous in the way that produces more disorientation than joy. His name on the radio, his voice coming out of strangers' cars and strangers' kitchens. His existence known to people who had never been in the same room with him and never would be. The machinery of the music industry had found him and organized itself around him with the efficiency that machinery applies to rare resources. And at 11 years old, he was inside that machinery in a way that was both extraordinary and entirely beyond his control. What he did not have, in the spring of 1962, was someone who talked to him the way people talk to children. His name was Amos Tibbs. He was 44 years old. He was a janitor at the Motown Records building on West Grand Boulevard in Detroit. A tall, quiet man from Mississippi who had come north in 1949 with his wife and his 2 daughters and had been cleaning the floors and the windows and the bathrooms of various buildings in Detroit ever since. He had worked at Motown since 1961, which meant he had been there almost from the beginning. And he had developed, over that year, the particular invisibility that maintenance workers develop in buildings full of people whose attention is directed elsewhere. He saw everything. He was noticed by almost no one. He noticed Stevie. Not because Stevie was famous. Amos was not a man who organized the world around fame, but because Stevie was 11 years old and navigating a large building alone, which produced a specific expression that Amos recognized from his own daughter's childhoods. The expression of a child trying to appear competent in a situation that is too large for them, trying to take up the right amount of space, trying to read a room they cannot quite read yet. He had seen that expression on his daughter's face on her first day of school, and he had never forgotten what it looked like. The first time he spoke to Stevie was on a Thursday afternoon in April. Stevie had been in a recording session that ran 4 hours past its scheduled end, and had emerged into the hallway at 7:30 in the evening with his cane and his headphones around his neck and the expression of someone who is very tired and trying not to show it. Amos was mopping the hallway floor. He said, "You want to sit down for a minute?" Stevie stopped. He turned toward the voice. He said, "What?" Amos said, "You've been in there a long time. There's a bench at the end of the hall. I just thought you might want to sit for a minute before wherever you're going next." There was a pause. Then Stevie said, "Yeah, okay." He sat at the end of the hall for 20 minutes. Amos mopped the floor around him and did not make conversation and did not ask about the music or the sessions or what it was like to be on the radio. He mopped the floor. When he got to the far end of the hallway, he came back and asked Stevie if he wanted a cup of water. Stevie said yes. Amos got him a cup of water. Then Stevie's handler came looking for him, and Amos went back to mopping. That was the first time. Over the following months, a pattern established itself in the way that certain things establish themselves between people who are not paying attention to the establishing, gradually, without announcement. Until one day it exists as completely as if it had always existed. On the days when Stevie was recording at the building, he would find Amos somewhere in it at some point in the day, sometimes in the hallway, sometimes in the stairwell where Amos took his breaks, sometimes in the small room on the second floor where cleaning supplies were kept and where Amos ate his lunch from a paper bag his wife packed every morning. Stevie would arrive and sit, and Amos would continue whatever he was doing, and they would talk, or not talk, with the same ease, about things that had nothing to do with music. Amos talked about Mississippi, about what the land looked like in September, which was the month he loved most because the heat was just beginning to consider releasing its hold, and the light went amber in a way that made everything look like a photograph of itself. He talked about his daughters, their names and their ages, and the specific ways they were becoming themselves, which he described with the precision of a man who paid close attention to the people around him and found them endlessly interesting. He talked about Detroit in winter, which he did not love, but had made his peace with, the way he had made his peace with most things that were not going to change, regardless of his feelings about them. Stevie talked about sounds, not about music, about sounds. The way the building sounded different on a Sunday morning than it did on a Tuesday afternoon. The way he could tell from the acoustics of a room how large it was, and whether the ceiling was high or low. The way rain on a window and rain on a street were completely different experiences of the same event, and how he had spent a long time learning to understand the world through the specific information that sound carried, which was more information than most people understood sound to carry. Amos listened to all of this with the quality of attention that Amos brought to everything. Complete, unhurried, never redirecting toward himself when the other person was still going somewhere. He asked questions that were interested rather than impressive. He did not ask about blindness in the way that people usually asked about blindness, which was to say, he did not organize his curiosity around the absence. He asked about the presence, about what Stevie heard that other people missed, about what the world delivered to him that it withheld from people who were looking at it instead of listening to it. Nobody had ever asked Stevie those questions before. In October 1962, near the end of a long recording day, Stevie had been sitting in Amos's supply room eating a sandwich that Amos's wife had packed and that Amos had wordlessly handed over when he arrived. And he said, Do you ever think about what happens to a song after you make it? Like where it goes? Amos thought about this for a moment. He said, I think it goes to whoever needs it. Stevie was quiet for a moment. Then he said, what if it goes to someone and they don't know it came from you? Amos said, then it still got there. Stevie thought about that for a long time. In November of that year, the recordings that had been produced over those months were being prepared for release. And the schedule at the building was changing, and the particular rhythms of the year were winding down. On Stevie's last regular recording day before the holiday break, he arrived at the supply room at his usual time and found Amos there with his lunch. He sat down. They talked about Mississippi again, about whether Amos would go back for Christmas. He would not. The drive was too far and the winter roads uncertain. But his mother was still there, and he thought about the land in December, which was a different kind of beautiful from September, bleaker and more honest. When it was time for Stevie to leave, he stood and picked up his cane and then stopped. He said, can you do something for me? Amos said, what? Stevie said, sing something. Just whatever you sing. I want to hear what your voice sounds like when you're not thinking about it. Amos was quiet for a moment. Then, without making anything of it, in the same register he used for everything, matter of fact, unpretentious, belonging entirely to himself, he sang 4 bars of a gospel song his mother had sung in their kitchen in Mississippi when he was a child. His voice was low and slightly rough, and not a trained voice in any sense. It was a voice that had never been asked to be anything other than what it was, which gave it a quality that trained voices sometimes lose. The quality of sounding like it came from an actual person, rather than from the idea of a voice. Stevie listened with the particular quality of his listening. When Amos stopped, Stevie stood quietly for a moment. Then he nodded once, the way he nodded when something had landed where it needed to land. He never forgot that voice. The following year, the year after, the years that became decades, Amos Tibbs remained at the Motown building until it relocated, then found other buildings, other floors to clean, other windows to make clear. He followed the ordinary arc of a working life, with the same steadiness he brought to everything. Retiring in 1988 at the age of 70, spending his remaining years in the house in Detroit, where he had raised his daughters, with his wife until she passed in 2003. And alone after that with his garden and his church and the gradual accommodation that a person makes with a life that has arrived at its final stretch. He listened to Stevie Wonder's music on the radio for 60 years. He never contacted him. He never tried. It had not been that kind of friendship. It had been a supply room and a bench at the end of a hallway, and a paper bag lunch and a conversation between an 11-year-old child and a 44-year-old janitor about where songs went after they were made. It had been real, and it had been its own complete thing, and he did not need it to be anything more than what it was. He was 95 years old. His younger daughter, a woman named Cecilia, had brought him to New York for a medical appointment and had, on the day before the appointment, secured 2 standby tickets to The Tonight Show because her father had watched The Tonight Show for 50 years. She thought it would make him happy to see it in person. She had not known Stevie Wonder was performing. She had found out at the taping, from the program insert, and had watched her father's face when he read the name, read it with his fingers, along the raised lettering on the cardstock, the way he had been reading things since the macular degeneration had taken the last of his useful vision 4 years ago. She said he had not moved for a long time after he read it. And then, 40 seconds into the second song, Amos Tibbs had simply begun to sing. Subscribe and leave a comment, because the most powerful part of this story is still ahead. Behind the scenes, nobody had arranged any of this. Not Stevie Wonder's team, not the Tonight Show producers, not Cecilia, who was sitting beside her father in the back row near the entrance with her hand over her mouth and tears she could not have explained to anyone running down her face. The production team had no protocol and no plan. The segment producer stood at the edge of the stage with her headset on and said nothing into it. The director held every camera and waited, understanding that his only job right now was to not interrupt what was happening by trying to shape it. On the stage, Jimmy Fallon had heard Stevie say the name and had understood, without the full story, without any of the details that would come later, that what he was witnessing was a man hearing, from across a room and across 62 years, the voice of someone who had talked to him the way people talked to children, at the precise moment in his life when he had needed that most and had not known he needed it. He stepped back from the lip of the stage. He looked at his band leader. He looked at the audience. He looked at the back of the studio where two ushers were now kneeling beside an elderly man in the back row with a woman beside him who was trying to hold everything together and not quite managing it. And Jimmy Fallon turned away from the camera because he could not hold his face into anything. And when he turned back, his face was not held into anything, and he had stopped trying. But this is the moment no one in the studio and no one watching at home ever saw coming. Stevie Wonder stood up from the piano bench. He stood the way a man stands when standing is not a performance, but a direction, oriented toward something, moving before the decision to move has fully formed. He said to Jimmy, without turning toward him, without any of the apparatus of a television production, "Take me to him." Jimmy came off the stage. Stevie took his arm at the elbow, his cane in his other hand, and they walked together through the studio, through the camera operators who pulled back to give them room, through the audience who parted without being asked, down the aisle toward the back row where Amos Tibbs was sitting very still, with his daughter's hand in both of his and his face carrying the expression of a man who has lived a long life honestly and is now inside a moment he does not have the equipment to have anticipated. Stevie stopped when his cane found the edge of Amos's row. He turned toward him. His free hand found the armrest of the seat, then Amos's arm, then his hand. He held it. Neither of them said anything for a moment. Then Stevie said, "You asked me once where songs go after you make them." Amos's voice, when it came, was the same voice, low and slightly rough and not performing anything. He said, "I remember." Stevie said, "I've been trying to answer that question for 62 years. He paused. "Every song I ever wrote, I was trying to answer it." He stopped. "I think the answer is they go to the person who made you believe they were worth making in the first place." Amos Tibbs said nothing. His hand tightened around Stevie's. Cecilia was not trying to hold anything together anymore. In the audience, 300 people had dissolved the individual membranes between them, the social distance, the strangeness, the ordinary separateness of people who have come to the same room from different lives and become one thing, a single receiving instrument for something that the room was transmitting at a frequency that bypassed the mind and went directly into the body. A man in the 7th row had his face in his hands. A woman near the aisle had turned toward the stranger beside her, and the stranger had put an arm around her without discussion. Jimmy Fallon was standing in the aisle 6 feet behind Stevie Wonder, and he was crying in the way that people cry when they have stopped thinking about crying and simply are, without management, without apology, without any effort toward the camera or away from it. Questlove began to play very softly. Not a song, not a rhythm, just a sound, brushes on the snare in the gentlest possible motion, barely a sound, a texture, something to give the air in the room, a shape to hold what it was holding. The band came in beneath it, like a breath, soft as possible. And then Stevie Wonder, still holding Amos Tibbs's hand, still standing in the aisle of the Tonight Show studio, began to sing. Not the song from the performance. A different song. One that nobody in the room had heard arranged this way. Stripped to nothing, just his voice in the room. Close and unmiked and belonging entirely to the moment and the man whose hand he was holding. And Amos Tibbs, 95 years old, with his daughter beside him and 62 years between the supply room and this aisle, listened with the quality of attention that had always been his particular gift. When it ended, the silence lasted for 5 full seconds. Then the studio came apart in the way that only happens when something real has moved through a room and left everyone inside it changed. Share and subscribe. Make sure this story is never forgotten. Amos Tibbs had his medical appointment the following morning in New York. The procedure went well. He and Cecilia drove back to Detroit 2 days later. He did not talk much on the drive, which was his way when something large was being processed. Cecilia did not ask him to. He died 4 months later, in June 2024, at 95 years old, in his house in Detroit, in the garden where he grew tomatoes every summer, in the specific way that a person dies when they have completed what they came to do. His daughter said he had been happy since February in a way that was different from ordinary happiness. Settled, she said, like something had been put back where it belonged. Stevie Wonder was told on a Tuesday morning. He did not comment publicly. He went into the studio the following week and recorded something that no one from his team was permitted to describe to anyone outside the room while it was being made. The song was released in September 2024. Its title is a single word: Amos. In the liner notes, in the space where producers and collaborators are usually credited, there is one sentence: "For the man who taught me where songs go." Some voices stay with you not because they were extraordinary, but because they found you at the exact moment you needed to understand that the work was worth doing. And they never asked for anything in return.